What does history look like? What does literature look like? What does it look like when you take diverse women's perspectives seriously?
A colleague of mine who asked what I was doing at the library, and I said I was going to teach this course on women writers, and he said, well, you know, I'd like to teach a course on fishing sometime. That was not an unusual response to what we were doing.
We were overcoming the fact that women had not been talked about, or they had been distorted, or they had been trivialized. So the first thing was just to take women seriously.
Joan and Miriam and people like Mary Rothbart and others involved had to spend quite a bit of effort in making their case, because even though I don't think they were ever told that this is not a significant area for research, nevertheless, there was not a lot of enthusiasm.
One Saturday I was at Saturday market, had already started, I guess, and this guy on the faculty, whom I knew very slightly, yelled at me across the street, "You goddamn feminist." You know, it was not very gentlemanly, I must say.
Feminist education is a process deeply rooted in the women's movement because feminist aims include the elimination of oppression and discrimination on the basis of sex, race, age, class, religion, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, as well as other barriers to human liberation inherent to the structure of our society. Because feminist education is not only the pursuit of knowledge about women, but also the development of knowledge for women, a force which furthers the realization of feminist aims.
Feminists had very vigorous debates in the late 1960s and early 1970s about what women's equality would look like, as well as what kinds of policies, what sorts of changes would move women from here to there. And there were, frankly, lots of disagreements about what women's equality would mean.
In the late 60s, there was a great deal of activity going on in the campus, but I think it had more to do with peace and peace marches in the late 60s, and then it was the early 70s that at least I became more aware of feminism. A huge change had taken place in the 10 years between, say, 63 and 73. Many more women on the campus, a different kind of woman, much more self-confident woman. And let me give you an example of that. In the early 60s, I said I found teaching sort of difficult and not all that much fun. And the response was, well, you don't have to. Why don't you quit? In the 70s, I said, teaching is still not all that much fun to me, or it's stressful. They said, of course it's stressful. Let us help you. We'll be a support group. So I joined a group of graduate students and some faculty who were talking about teaching and strategies about teaching. And the whole idea was, well, yes, it's hard, but you can do it, which of course is what we've been telling men for years. But women had that option of dropping out, and it was much nicer to have the feeling that you had a group that was behind you.
One conference I went to, a speaker noted that the women's movement in the 20s died down. I mean, it's like every 30, 40 years the women's movement has to arise again. The next generation says, oh, everything's taken care of, and then the other generation comes along and says, no, it isn't, and they start another movement. But she said this one is going to be different because, and this was a group of academics, a huge room of academic women, because we write, is what she said. And I think that's what happened to solidify feminist and gender studies within the university, while at the same time women's rights were being battered around, I should say, by the society at large, we never lost some of that energy.
Mellow Marie, she's not the same as she used to be. There's been a change in her personality, oh can't you see? Whatever happened to Mellow Marie? Mellow Marie, she's not afraid now to stand up and fight for the things which she thinks are right. And if you disagree, at least you know that she's being free enough to say how she feels and tell the whole world about her hopes and ideals, coming out from behind that sweet mask of smiles and tears.
I was really ready for the women's movement, as I was not happy being a sociologist or in this department, but I didn't know exactly why. Of course, as soon as the women's movement got going, it was clear why. I had been living in a practically totally male world. I was the first woman they'd ever hired as a regular faculty member in this department. I was the second woman to get a PhD from this department. And it was a very alienating environment.
It really wasn't a very pleasant or rewarding thing for me at the time because there were no women graduate students. There had been a few. The time I was teaching, there were none. There were no other women on the faculty, on the sociology faculty, very few women in the university in general. And so you felt like something of a sore thumb, a peculiar person who was doing something strange. And though people would say, isn't it nice you're teaching, you never felt that this was a normal thing for somebody to be doing.
At the time also, because there was a women's movement, which was nationwide, but it was just starting, and we were all, a lot of us about the same age, and many of us out of graduate school. I think one of the ways to understand the rise of women's studies, the rise of ethnic studies, the rise of women's history, is that the population of graduate schools had changed because of the national effort to create more teachers.
The period in which women's studies comes to be is the period when higher education is really becoming a democratic institution in this country for the first time in American history. And women in the academy, both students and faculty and staff as well, I'm sure, thought of the university as both a resource for them, a place where they could gather the knowledge they needed in order to promote their programs of equality for women and advancement for women. But also the universities were places where men had a kind of lock on knowledge and where knowledge was seen as a male department and so on. So that tension between the university as a symbol of patriarchy or sexism, whatever term you wanted to use, and the university as a resource for promoting feminist goals, including the production of knowledge about women, was really, I think, at the heart of launching women's studies as a project in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
So the University Feminists came about in 1971, and during that same time, several things were happening. Joan Acker and several professors and students were authoring a report called The Status of Women at the University of Oregon, and they found several things: that women were receiving tenure track positions at a lower rate than men, that their pay was less than men, and that they were experiencing sexual discrimination in the job workplace at around 43%. And then the University Feminists were founded, and they took on a really strong stance around activism, trying to address several different things. So in the next 5 years, they talked a lot about content, editing course content material to see if there was a gender bias in the textbook and the classes that were being offered. They argued and fought for gynecological services to be available here on campus for women. They argued for more feminist courses to be offered on campus. And many of these different things that they were fighting for actually came to fruition in that short amount of time, which is pretty exciting.
We had always had, at least from the time I arrived in 1957, a substantial cohort of female graduate students. Usually not the majority, but more than just a token here and there. Most of them did not go on to get big jobs, though. The job market was very good in the 60s. But the ones who got the jobs, if I remember correctly, good jobs were the men. And the women tended to drop out disproportionately, maybe because they could see, finally, the slimness of the job situation. Maybe at a woman's college or a minor college or something like that, they could be hired.
When we heard about affirmative action, the idea of affirmative action and affirmative action plans, this was before they became an official policy of the U.S. government for institutions that got a lot of government money, federal money. We thought it would be a very good idea for the University of Oregon to be a leader and establish an affirmative action plan. This must have been 71, 72. So we made appointments and talked with some top people, but the whole thing got absolutely negative votes.
And we had to be prodded, by the affirmative action policy. But it was turned out, in our department at least, to be a fairly easily accomplished prodding job, because we were mostly tolerant, liberal-minded people, even though we had been kind of blind to the whole feminist concerns until they were pointed out to us, But then we got sort of easily convinced.
First, we spent a lot of time proving that women were discriminated against. You couldn't just say it, because that would show you were biased. People would say that, you're biased if you think women are discriminated against. So you had to prove it. Then things became much more theoretical, and I would say sometimes sort of obscure.
There was the question of legitimacy. Was this a legitimate area to study? And I think there were lots of men who, on the faculty at the University of Oregon, who didn't think it was legitimate.
Some of the administrators in leadership here during those years did not understand the value of the interdisciplinary work in women's and gender studies, and did not understand the value of studying gender and power and studying intersectionality, the relationships between gender, race, class, sexuality, and other categories. Didn't understand that those studies were legitimate and constituted a legitimate discipline in their own right.
Because one of the things that in any new discipline that you have is how to justify it, how to say it's an academically viable topic. In order to become viable, you have to start writing essays and having them published. In order to write essays, many times you have to teach courses so you can begin to learn about the topic. But to teach the courses, you have to be academically viable. And so you're going around in circles trying to get someone to say, yeah, we'll try you.
There were really, really pitched struggles during the 1970s within the women's studies scholarly world around two things in particular: sexualities and race class. I would say as the decade wore on and into the 80s, the sort of global issues became more also part of that. Where's the center of the field going to be? So that was both in women's studies as an academic enterprise, but also in a lot of feminist organizations.
I and some others wrote a proposal for a Center for the Study of Women and took it to the Dean of the Graduate School, who was Aaron Novick at the time. Aaron sent out a memo to all department heads in the college asking them if they would support this kind of a center, because our idea was it should be interdisciplinary. Only one department head said that he supported, they were all men, that he supported it, and that was the head of the sociology department, Dick Hill. And so we could not make it an interdisciplinary department or center at that time because no other department would support it. So we made it the Center for the Sociological Study of Women.
Our office was on the basement of PLC. Those who know the University of Oregon will know PLC, that big ugly building. And there was women's studies, there was ethnic studies, there was environmental studies. You could tell by the colors, lavender, orange, and black, and the ferns of environmental studies. I used to walk down the hall and say to myself, this is the floor of ephemeral studies. I didn't think any of them would survive.
The Center for the Sociological Study of Women was established in 1973. That's also kind of the point in time at which University librarian Edward Kemp first contacted William Harris for the Jane Grant papers and finding out if the university could acquire those papers. Harris was very, very interested in what was happening on campus. Did we have a women's center? Did we have a women's studies program? And Kemp offered the information that we had a very small women's research center that was just started and that this was moving forward. And Harris at that point was very interested in bringing his funding to the university.
He clearly wanted this money settled in honor of his wife. And he had offered it to Harvard. They wanted the money, but they didn't want to do the topic. So we end up with it, this little place in the West that nobody had heard of.
He was dedicated to her and dedicated to doing what she wanted to do. She was the one who wanted to give the money for research on women.
Jane Grant was born in 1892 in Missouri, and she was raised in Kansas. It was during a period of time where women were expected either to be school teachers or to marry, and she didn't want to do either. At the age of 17, shortly after she graduated from high school, Jane moved to New York to study voice. She stayed in New York for several years, earning a living on stage as a singer and performer. But it was very difficult to make ends meet as a single woman in New York in the early 20th century. So she decided to take a business course and to support herself through being a stenographer at various places. When Grant was hired as a stenographer at the New York Times in 1914, she was told there would never be any advancement for a woman at the paper. But she was also in the company of newspapermen and the intelligentsia of New York City, was getting introduced to society circles and realized she really wanted to be a part of that and really needed to learn. So she asked for help. She asked other journalists to teach her how to write stories. And she volunteered her time at the newspaper, writing stories, laying out columns, basically making a nuisance of herself until her editor realized he could get a bunch of free labor out of her and started assigning her stories. That's how she became a journalist. During the First World War, she was a performer with the YMCA Entertainment Bureau in Paris, where she met her first husband, Harold Ross. Ross, who was an editor with the Stars and Stripes. It was a newspaper for the Army at the time. Ross fell instantly in love with her at a poker game, and he ardently wooed her in Paris and in New York City. Jane Grant and Harold Ross were married in 1920. And it's an interesting story because on the day of their wedding, when a witness first called Jane Grant Mrs. Ross, she was shocked. She didn't realize that her own name could be taken away from her so easily. Ross also said, "I don't think I like that. I think you should be Grant." And she said, "Yes, I agree, I should be Grant." So they stayed that way, Ross and Grant, throughout their marriage. Later on, she was the co-founder of The New Yorker with her husband, Harold Ross. She was instrumental in the establishment of The New Yorker because of her society connections. She was the one to actually fundraise and get the money for The New Yorker in terms of its launch, and she was also extremely active in its circulation. Jane Grant was friends with Ruth Hale, who notoriously sent her passport back to the passport agency when they sent it to her in her husband's name. She said, "No, my name is Ruth Hale. I'm keeping it. That's my name." Hale and Grant together in 1920 formed the Lucy Stone League. Lucy Stone was the first woman in the 1800s to deliberately keep her name after marriage as a suffragist. Jane Grant and the Lucy Stone League were some of the first organizations to really address issues of discrimination against women, and that, I think, is their lasting legacy because of what they attempted to do in terms of raising the consciousness about the custom of removing a woman's name in marriage and what that meant for her identity and what that meant for her legal rights. Raising awareness around that set up in the 1950s and the 1960s much larger issues regarding women and discrimination and the fight for equality. The stress of the Roaring '20s, Jane Grant's very elaborate social life, and the publishing of The New Yorker in the 1920s eventually led to the end of their marriage. In the 1930s, Jane Grant went on a world expedition, and when she returned, she met William Harris at a cocktail party, and he fell instantly in love. William Harris had always supported feminist interests, largely because of his wife, Jane Grant. She was such an incredible mover and shaker in the 1950s during the second reinvigoration of the Lucy Stone League. During that period, as president of the Lucy Stone League, she was a prolific letter writer and contacted many government organizations and worked on women's rights issues through the 1950s and the 1960s. Harris was a strong supporter of women and research on women and was key in ensuring that Jane Grant's wishes to establish a center for the study of women was followed through after her death in 1972. Kemp wasn't a fundraiser, so when he realized that Harris wanted to give this money somewhere, he went straight to University President Robert Clark to say, "We have this opportunity, what do we do?"
Bob Clark took a fundraising trip to New York, and he talked to Harris also, and Harris indicated that he was interested.
He had started talking to him, "Oh, there is a program." He just had learned about this program at the University of Women's Studies and told him a little bit about it.
Harris came back and visited campus about a year later to see CSSW and take a look at what was happening on campus, and very shortly after that changed as well.
We all had a dinner with him at Bob Clark's house. By the end of the evening, somebody said, well, we ought to talk about this center and if you want to give us some money. And he said, yeah, he thought he wanted to give it to us, and that we should have complete freedom to do whatever we wanted to with it. William Harris was a tall, handsome, elderly gentleman who obviously came from the East Coast elite. That's probably one of the reasons that some of his East Coast friends were so shocked that he gave the money to this ridiculously unknown West Coast university.
Once the money came, someone described it as the Coke bottle falling from the sky. People began to argue about what should happen with the money and what shape the center should take.
What we didn't want in the beginning, we wanted to use it for research. That's what the money was intended for. So how do you prop up a program like Women's Studies with the research money? And we wanted the university to take responsibility for that. They thought we would just jump in, take over, and all the money would go to women's studies and a few grants would be given. And we resisted that a lot. So we kept it separate. That doesn't mean that the people who were involved in teaching women's studies were not also involved in the center.
The germ of what became the Center for the Study of Women in Society began with a center located in the sociology department called the Center for the Sociological Study of Women in Society. And like so many projects at the time that connected the second wave of feminism outside of the academy to what was going on inside of the academy, these women made their own relationship to the university the first subject of their research.
One of the reasons why I wanted to move in the direction of center-identified research was that I think while there was respect for CSWS as an entity, I don't think there was full appreciation nor the full potential of it being seen as an actual research center. It was kind of like people would constantly get women's studies, the center, and the women's center mixed up. It's like it was all one thing.
But the fact that we have these analytical tools, that we can think about every question in the academy through the lens of gender is really a result of the establishment of women's studies at precisely the time that CSWS got its start.
Women's Studies and CSWS and the Women's Center and what was then ethnic studies that then grew from there, all collaborated a lot on classes and on curriculum and on referrals and on students being able to kind of be double majors or get a certificate in one or minor in something, and there was lots of communication. It seems like mostly through the graduate students who are moving back and forth through these different organizations, and they were relating with the faculty and they were relating with the students, and it was my experience that kept growing, and that CSWS became a hub of that.
The field was tumultuous, exciting, expanding, interdisciplinary, but also with a really clear political edge, and I think varying connections between academic and non-academic feminist projects.
I did the usual teaching, assigned courses, you know, the department assigned me all kinds of courses at first, but by about 1972, I was teaching almost only about women, and we didn't have the term gender yet, but I was teaching courses with a feminist perspective.
The classroom was very different than it is now. And one of the remarks that I make about women's history or women's studies in general is that when I started out, I was using those things from 1920. I was in the 396s of the Dewey Decimal System, where women were classified among customs and costumes. The atmosphere in the classroom was different, and we had this ethic that students could teach you just as you taught them. And I think in the early years of women's studies that was really true, because everyone was sharing their experiences.
Are we ghouls? Children of horror? The joke? Don't tell nobody. Don't tell a soul. Are we animals? Have we gone crazy? I can't hear anything but maddening screams and soft strains of death.
I had classrooms where I had mothers and daughters. I had classrooms where I had women whose husbands had just divorced them in the 19th year of marriage, so they wouldn't get the Social Security. So there was a lot for people to learn from each other. There are people who had worked, people who hadn't worked, and I created this curriculum where there were undergraduate facilitators, and I met with them every week. So there was a lot of participation that was going on.
There was a program through the EMU, through the university, that was called the Search Program, and undergraduate students could teach classes for credit through this program. And one of the classes that I had taken was a class on gay and lesbian studies, and that was pretty exciting. And then I decided that I wanted to teach something just on lesbian studies. And so I did that early 80s, maybe 82, I'm not sure of the exact date. And as an undergraduate through the Search Program, and it was called Lesbians, Myth and Reality. And we opened it up, the community people could come into the classes too, and people taking it for credit. And in the community, they called it Lesbians in the Midst of Reality. So it had two different names.
So we work closely, as closely as possible with the Women and Gender Studies Department. We oftentimes contact professors to learn what types of books they're reading and what types of scholars to bring to campus. Whenever we bring a speaker, we try to make sure that they come into the classroom and give a workshop or a lecture series there. We have faculty come and talk with our staff every year, throughout the year, to talk about issues that are happening in the field. And then we have a lot of crossover between students. So a lot of the students that are in the classrooms are on staff here, or our students are GTFing or leading the discussion groups for the classes. And then we work with the Center for the Study of Women in Society around things like this conference that's coming up, and trying to support it through financial means as well as volunteers, and just being at the table to add to the dialogue.
We'd been in existence at that time since '73, so it wasn't new. It was 18 years old or so. But I don't think the center had garnered certainly the economic, fiscal support of the institution. And I think there were still people that thought, why do they have all this money? And by the way, all this money was not that much money, but it was more money than a lot of other places had.
But it was so exciting when the money came in that just elaborated everything that could be done. I mean, all the people that got hired, all the visiting professors, all the ways that women's studies changed, and everything that was influenced by that. That was a big transition.
We came up with this idea of research interest groups, RIGs. There are RIGs all over campus now, but it was our moniker. It was our idea. It did not go unchallenged. People in the humanities in particular were like, we don't do that, you know. And it turned out that they ended up doing some of the most exciting collaborative research. We had our first RIG affair, we called it the RIG affair, and we brought people together in different rooms under sort of different themes and said, see if you can make something happen. What might you all or some subsection of you want to do? And you know, I should have reviewed this, but numbers of RIGs emerged out of that process, and then numbers of RIGs emerged over time. But the concept of a research interest group that really brought people together to think, to do work together, to collaborate, to plan events under the auspices of a RIG was something that happened, I think, early in the 90s.
Well, I think the Americas RIG for me, I mean, it's been a very important space, and even before that, I directed a project with funding from CSWS that was about gender and family issues in Latino populations here. We had a big conference that produced a bilingual memorial book. We had a whole series of activities over 2 years in the community.
Very exciting projects emerged out of many of the different RIGs. And it helped to begin to create this CSWS identified infrastructure of intellectual work separate from the individual scholar.
And the RIG I've been primarily involved in is the Social Science Feminist Network RIG. And I co-coordinated that RIG for 2 years and was part of a large research project where we looked at time use among academics at among faculty at the U of O. And that RIG really, I mean, my participation in the RIG gave me a lot of things. It gave me community in my department and with other feminists, social scientists. It gave me experience in managing a research project. And then as part of that research project, we put on a symposium, so I got experience, you know, doing inviting a national speaker and you know, putting that whole thing together.
And then we also went on to produce other kinds of projects. I have a book that's being published this fall by Duke University Press called We Are the Face of Oaxaca, Testimony and Social Movements, with a website that goes with it that's very much related to the Americas group in that experience. We have films that were made. Gabriela Martinez made a film. I have another website that also was about the social movement. Stephanie Wood produced 2 summer institutes for teachers with NEH funding out of that experience. And there has been a generation of younger scholars who've come in who have, for example, focused on issues of Afro-descendant women, and issues of race and gender in the Americas through a wonderful series of speakers. We've read people's books and discussed their books, their work with them on campus. So I think it's a very exciting and sort of vibrant part of CSWS that has grown in new directions. It's very healthy because it has young faculty coming in. It has a long history, and it's connected to things that have mattered to CSWS for a long time, but also taking it in new directions.
Also, of course, it made it possible to help other women scholars and to bring them together. I think that's the major thing that the center did, is to continually, or once they got over the hump of what it was going to be like, to continually bring women together, and men together too. Anyone who's interested in women and gender, usually could find a place at the center. If not in getting a grant or applying for a grant, be part of the seminars.
My dissertation is titled Gender in Context, Transmasculinities and Transgender Experiences in 3 U.S. Regions. So what I'm looking at is I'm investigating the lives of female to male transgender people in 3 U.S. regions, looking at California, the U.S. South, and the Midwest. My research, it's seen as interesting to other people, but it's not seen as something that's central to, really central to the major questions of sociology. And therefore, I don't especially initially, wasn't getting the kind of funding or kind of support for that research. And so CSWS has given me that absolutely necessary funding to go and do those trips, to collect those interviews, and the time to write.
When I came to the University of Oregon, I had not considered issues of gender, but as I started working through my dissertation, going through to some colloquiums and symposiums hosted by the Center for Studies for Women, it became more important and significant to actually question issues of gender, issues of race and ethnicity within my work.
In 2007, 2008, I co-directed CSWS with Stephanie Wood and Judith Music. And one of my big tasks that year was to run a search committee to produce a new director of CSWS. It was very exciting to be able to do an outside search to, look for a top-notch scholar who was going to be able to bring something different to the center, kind of build on what we did, but add to that profile. So in many ways, our most important mission that year was finding a director, and we were successful. We got Carol, and she's done a marvelous job. The other thing I was doing that year was incubating class. So I was really kind of leading this group of 3 people directing the center, but also working with a group of faculty to get a new center going through CSWS.
The Women of Color Project started in 2008, and it came from a grant that we received from the National Council for Research on Women. And the fund is from the Ford Foundation, and the title of the grant was Diversifying the Leadership of Women's Research Centers. And it seemed like a really good opportunity. I think women of color have always participated in the center, but not necessarily have led it or been in leadership roles or had sort of an institutional place in the center. And at that point, I think we were also dealing with issues of retention of faculty of color and women of color. And at the time that we wrote the grant, there were, I think, 5 or less tenured women of color faculty on our campus. So the push was to really get women of color central in the center, to sort of see the grant for the importance that it is in terms of diversifying leadership.
Well, diversifying a center, it's something that you cannot do overnight, and it is a process, and we have begun that process after hiring Carol Stabile as the director. The first associate director that we draw from the pool of the Women of Color project was Lamia Karim, who is an anthropologist, and she's a faculty member, associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. So she was the first associate director from the pool of Women of Color. And currently, I am the second associate director who has been also drawn from the pool of Women of Color here on campus.
right at the moment, CSWS is doing amazing stuff with technology and new media and the work around science fiction and speculative fiction in relation to the 40th anniversary. I find very exciting. I've taught courses on science fiction, so I think that's a great direction that it's been taking. I think that for me, the natural place for it to move in the future is to have a more global reach and to really think about women and gender and sexuality increasingly outside of the sort of global center, right, of Europe and North America.
One ways in which the center could expand the international capacity is by engaging with other scholars around the world internationally, and perhaps inviting scholars from other countries, non-European countries, maybe the Global South, to come here and have, let's say, a quarter at the center when they can share with us their knowledge, share with us the challenges that they face in the research on gender and all the intersectionalities that deal with gender and women's studies, like race, class, sexuality, all of that, and share with us how do they go about conducting that research in their specific regions of the world. I think that that will be a positive way of engaging the international conversation on this arena.
I think that the center is going to have to continue to be a leader in moving forward diversity efforts on this campus and gender equity efforts on this campus, because we still have a lot of work to do. I also think that the issue of how the endowment moves into the future is something to consider, because grant opportunities nationally and large grants are really drying up.
It's necessary to support the center, to support the endowment. I believe that the work we're doing is important. There are avenues for example, federal funding that are available for the study of women, the study of gender, but those tend to be very narrowly targeted toward the sciences, toward biology and the study of women's health, and to a lesser extent education and disparities there. But the kinds of cutting edge work that the center might support in, for example, philosophy or people working in communications or English or history, right? Those kinds of studies are much harder to find support for.
What the endowment from Jane Grant and her husband William Harris has provided to the Center for the Study of Women is credibility. And beyond that credibility, it has helped establishing the center as a place where we can engage in new areas of research and also interdisciplinary work. And I think that's fantastic. That's something that we have to keep doing at this center, and that we have to be pushing the boundaries of how we look at women's studies, gender studies, and all the different intersectionalities of that.
You know, when it comes to the challenges, I really do think that one of the challenges has to do with how we think about philanthropy. And philanthropy still remains understood in fairly conventional terms. You have the donor and his wife, and that's the way that you think about approaching people. But 70% of inheritable wealth in the future is going to be in the hands of women, because women inherit twice. They inherit from their parents and they inherit from their husbands. And so I think we need to think about the changes in donor profiles and the fact that there are lots of donors out there who are very interested in gender equity and diversity. And it's up to us to create exciting opportunities for them to give the kinds of gifts that make the difference that CSWS has made in the lives of students and faculty members and staff.
There's no declining need, no diminished need for the kind of intellectual community that CSWS has offered generations of scholars for whom this kind of work matters.
It has a really tremendous reach on campus, and it's been incredibly successful in creating community, creating scholarship, advancing research over the last 40 years, and I hope that it will continue to do so over the next 40.
But I also think it's made the University of Oregon visible, which, again, people are concerned about prestige. And so there are a lot of scholars here who do this work, and this work is considered by people now very important.
Maybe we need a little bigger megaphone, but the center has enough capital, cultural capital, that when it speaks, it's important, you know, it's heard. Not necessarily you snap your fingers and things change, but it is a place that has that legitimacy, and we need to keep using it.
I think Jane Grant would be very happy to see how the center has used the funding over the last 3 decades. I know, you know, from having read her papers and from having read some of the accounts, how interested she was in having research on women, in doing research, supporting research on women. But I think that Jane Grant was also forward thinking enough to understand the changes that have happened since the movement of her day.
I cannot wait for the 80th anniversary. None of us will be around. Well, maybe she will.
Women and gender studies, and women and ethnic studies, and women and science, and all of that can change and can influence the whole world being a happier, more peaceful place.